not to let them catch me act. It's really, what I strive for is to make people think that's the first time I ever seen it.
James Garner was in pain, real pain. His back was wrecked, his knees were shot, and the network didn't care. Behind the scenes, the Rockford Files was falling apart. There was no finale, just a sudden end, a bitter lawsuit, and secrets the studio tried to bury. Why was Garner forced to sue for money he was owed? What really killed the show? And how did the reunion movies prove it could never be the same again? This is the story of how the Rockford Files painfully ended, after everything went wrong. Let's discover. Section 1. The Rise of a TV Icon. Back in the 70s, television was drowning in detectives. Suits, guns, dames, shootouts, you knew the drill. And then came Jim Rockford, a guy who lived in a trailer, was always short on cash, usually got beat up more than he landed punches. He didn't carry a gun, he didn't chase glory. And somehow, that made him one of the most unforgettable private eyes ever put on screen. But how did a broke, reluctant investigator become one of the most iconic characters in American television? Why did the network turn its back on a show that was doing everything right? And what really happened behind the scenes that made it all fall apart? To understand the painful end of the Rockford Files, you have to start at the top. The show premiered in 1974, a time when detective shows were as common as commercials. From Columbo to Kojak, viewers were used to watching genius sleuths with perfect instincts and polished coats of authority. But Jim Rockford was different. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't smooth. He wasn't even licensed to carry a gun. He charged $200 a day plus expenses, lived in a run-down trailer parked on the beach, and drove a dusty Pontiac Firebird instead of a flashy sports car. He avoided danger when he could, took beatings more often than he gave them, and was just as likely to get conned as to solve a case. And audiences loved him for it. The character was the brainchild of two television veterans, Roy Huggins and Stephen J. Cannell. Huggins had a long track record. He had created The Fugitive and written for Maverick, a Western starring a young James Garner. That earlier show became The Blueprint. Brett Maverick, like Rockford, wasn't your typical action hero. He preferred wit over violence and avoided unnecessary conflict. What made Maverick stand out in the world of trigger-happy cowboys was the same thing that made Rockford special in a world of tough-talking detectives: restraint. Cannell, meanwhile, was still early in his career. He'd later go on to create The A-Team and 21 Jump Street, but in 1974, he was still building his name. Together, Huggins and Cannell took everything they knew about the genre and rewrote the rules. Casting Jim Rockford wasn't just smart, it was essential. James Garner didn't just fit the role was written with him in mind. His full name? James Scott Garner. The character? James Scott Rockford. That wasn't a coincidence. Garner brought charm, grit, vulnerability, and humor, often in the same scene. He wasn't afraid to look foolish. He wasn't afraid to bleed. Most importantly, he wasn't afraid to be human. In an era of macho TV men, Jim Rockford stood out because he felt real. And the show reflected that realism in every frame. Unlike most shows shot on tight indoor sets, the Rockford Files embraced real-world locations: the Pacific Coast Highway, Malibu beaches, gas stations, motels, trailer parks. The show didn't just look different, it felt different. And it sounded different too. The theme music, composed by Mike Post and Pete Carpenter, wasn't your standard suspense track. It was upbeat, funky, and oddly joyful. It became a Billboard hit, peaking at number 10 in 1975. Not many detective shows can say they made the charts. The show also redefined what a crime series could do with humor. Most TV detectives were dead serious. Jim Rockford? He cracked jokes, took cheap jobs, argued with his dad, hid his gun in a cookie jar buried in a pile of coffee beans. He made mistakes. He lied to get out of trouble. And yet, none of it made him less competent. It made him more believable. That's why audiences kept watching. And the show didn't just earn fans, it earned awards. It won 5 Primetime Emmys, including Outstanding Lead Actor for Garner in 1977. Critics praised its sharp writing, grounded storytelling, and unusual emotional depth. So what went wrong? How does a show this successful, this beloved, just stop? The answer isn't just one thing. It's a chain reaction of pain, pressure, betrayal, and a decision that would change TV history. Because no matter how good something is, if the machine behind it breaks, the whole thing falls apart. And the Rockford Files didn't just end. It was cut off. And the man who made it shine, he paid a price far bigger than anyone realized. Section 2. When everything went wrong. This part of the Rockford Files story was buried for years, but only recently, thanks to newly resurfaced production documents, lawsuit filings, and insider interviews, have we come to understand the full extent of the damage. And it's worse than anyone imagined. The truth is, this show didn't just end because of creative burnout or changing audience tastes. It was a slow-motion collapse driven by corporate neglect, physical agony, and a betrayal so deep it triggered one of the most bitter legal fights in television history. Why would a network let its most beloved actor suffer in silence? And how did a multi-million-dollar fraud push James Garner to the brink? From the outside, the Rockford Files looked unstoppable. 6 seasons in, the show was still pulling in strong ratings, still adored by fans, still winning awards. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. And at the center of that slow breakdown was James Garner himself. What many fans didn't know at the time was that Garner had been doing nearly all of his own stunt work since day one. Every fistfight, every fall, every high-speed car maneuver. If Rockford took a beating on screen, it was Garner taking the actual hit. He refused to use a stunt double unless absolutely necessary. And while that earned him admiration from crew and audiences alike, it came at a terrible cost. By the end of the 4th season, Garner was suffering from chronic knee pain and recurring back injuries. He also developed bleeding ulcers. These weren't small inconveniences, they were serious medical problems. He was in his late 40s, and doctors began warning him that continuing in this condition was not just unsustainable, it was dangerous. But the show kept pushing forward. There were no major adjustments to his physical workload, no long-term plan for scaling back the action scenes. NBC and Universal, despite being fully aware of Garner's condition, didn't intervene. They let him grind himself down to the bone. Why? Because the Rockford Files was making them money. By season 6, Garner's condition had worsened to the point that he was sometimes working with a heating pad strapped under his clothes. His movements became slower, his range of motion more limited. He was still showing up, still performing, still smiling through the pain. But the damage was catching up to him. Medical reports at the time documented serious spinal stress and degenerative knee issues. These were not wear and tear injuries. These were the result of long-term, high-impact trauma. And still, the studio did not put the show on pause. They didn't restructure the scripts. Instead, they began quietly planning for an early exit. That exit came without warning. Halfway through season 6, NBC made the decision to pull the plug. No announcement, no farewell episode, no closure. 1 week, The Rockford Files was airing new cases, and the next week, it was gone. For fans, it felt like a gut punch. And for Garner, it was worse. He wasn't just saying goodbye to a role, he was walking away from years of physical suffering, emotional investment, and, as it would turn out, financial exploitation. What Garner discovered after the show ended was even more shocking than how it ended. Like many lead actors of long-running shows, Garner had a back-end deal. This meant that he was entitled to a share of the profits from reruns, DVD sales, syndication, and international broadcasting. These profits, known as net profits, are often where the real money is made in television. And The Rockford Files was a gold mine. It had gone into syndication, aired in multiple countries, and remained in demand long after it left prime time. But when Garner's lawyers began examining Universal's financial reports, they noticed something strange. The show was generating income, but the payments to Garner were unusually low. Suspiciously low. Universal was reporting almost no net profit. Their accounting showed that The Rockford Files was just barely breaking even. Garner didn't buy it. He hired forensic accountants to go through the numbers, and what they found pointed to a practice that, while sadly common in Hollywood, was infuriating: creative accounting. This is a tactic where studios inflate expenses, misreport revenue, or shift profits to other subsidiaries in order to claim that a show didn't actually make money, even when it obviously did. Garner believed that Universal was engaging in this tactic to deny him what he was owed. In response, he filed a lawsuit in 1983 for $2.2 million, or roughly 37.5% of what he believed were the show's net profits at the time. This lawsuit was no small matter. It dragged on for years and sent shockwaves through the industry. Garner wasn't just suing for money, he was suing for the right to be treated fairly. He was challenging a studio that had profited off his physical labor while underreporting earnings. It was personal, and it took a toll. In interviews years later, Garner would speak candidly about how betrayed he felt. He didn't just play Jim Rockford. He was Rockford. And just like Rockford, he found himself fighting a system that didn't care if it left him broken. So why didn't the public know any of this at the time? Because Universal kept things quiet. There was no press conference, no statement, no defense. They knew the optics were bad. A beloved actor suing for money he earned while recovering from real injuries sustained on their set? That wouldn't play well in the press. Eventually, they settled out of court. The exact terms remain sealed, but insiders say the final payout was substantial, enough to avoid a courtroom trial, but not enough to undo the damage. And that's why fans say The Rockford Files didn't just end. It painfully ended. It was a slow, agonizing breakdown that played out in private. Garner gave everything he had to make the character authentic. And the very people who benefited most from that effort, studio executives, network decision-makers, let him burn out for it. They let him limp through that final season, knowing they wouldn't give him a proper send-off. And when the show was gone, they tried to shortchange him one last time. There was no grand finale. No credits roll with a thank you. Just silence. Section 3. The War for Rights and Respect. When a show like The Rockford Files goes into syndication, meaning it's licensed out to other networks for reruns, it generates ongoing revenue for years, even decades. This is especially true for a show that remained critically acclaimed and widely viewed long after its original run. By the early 1980s, The Rockford Files was airing all over the United States and internationally. It was also being released for home viewing, repackaged in syndication bundles, and used to attract advertisers. This is where the real money in television is made. not during the initial airing, but in the long-term licensing. Garner, as the star and co-producer, had a contractual agreement that entitled him to a percentage of those syndication profits. That type of deal, known as a back-end or net profit participation agreement, is common for top-tier talent. In theory, it meant Garner would continue to be paid as long as the Rockford Files was generating revenue. But as time went on, the payments he received didn't match what he expected. They were smaller, less frequent, and in some cases, non-existent. So he asked Universal for a detailed breakdown of the show's financials. What he got back didn't make sense. Universal was claiming that the Rockford Files had barely broken even. Despite airing in syndication across dozens of markets, it was somehow still operating at a loss, or at least not generating significant profit. Garner didn't believe it. He hired a legal team and brought in forensic accountants to examine the studio's records. What they found was disturbing. According to Garner's lawyers, Universal had engaged in what's often called creative accounting. This is a legal gray area where studios manipulate reported earnings to avoid paying out back-end shares. They might inflate internal costs, shift profits to other divisions, or use accounting tricks to make a successful show look unprofitable on paper. In the case of the Rockford Files, Garner's team argued that Universal had deliberately underreported revenue and overreported expenses, thereby reducing or eliminating the net profit on which his payments were based. In 1983, Garner filed a lawsuit against Universal for $2.2 million, what he and his team calculated as his rightful share of the show's net earnings. But the suit was about more than just the money. Garner had spent 6 years carrying the show on his back. Literally. He'd done his own stunts, worked through pain, and sacrificed his health. He had become the face of the series. And now, the studio that profited off his image was refusing to acknowledge that contribution. Universal didn't try to settle quickly. Instead, they stalled, filing motions, delaying court dates, and downplaying Garner's role in the show's success. These tactics, common in high-stakes entertainment lawsuits, were designed to wear him down and force a cheaper settlement. But Garner refused to fold. His lawsuit shook the industry. Other actors, showrunners, and writers began re-examining their contracts, looking closely at syndication, foreign rights, and royalties. What had once been quietly accepted was now being openly questioned. The case dragged on for years. It was costly, emotionally draining, and not what Garner wanted as part of his legacy. Eventually, the parties settled out of court. The terms were sealed, but insiders say he received a large payout and, more importantly, made a point. Vague accounting would no longer be tolerated. Still, the damage was done. Garner never worked with Universal again. He spoke openly in later interviews about how betrayed he felt, not just by the studio, but by an industry that enabled it. He gave them everything: effort, ratings, loyalty, and they tried to shortchange him. What else had they hidden behind closed doors? Section 4. The cast, the characters, and what we lost. If you want to understand why the Rockford Files still hurts to lose, you have to look beyond the headlines about lawsuits and canceled episodes. The real blow came from the characters, the voices, faces, and rhythms that made the show feel alive. It wasn't just a procedural. It wasn't just a vehicle for James Garner. The Rockford Files created a world so vivid, so offbeat, and fully realized that pulling the plug on it midway through its 6th season felt less like the end of a show and more like the sudden loss of something real. Why did fans never get closure? Why were we never given a proper goodbye? Start with Angel Martin. Played by Stuart Margolin, Angel was a 2-bit con artist with a greasy smile, bad ideas, and an uncanny ability to get Jim Rockford into trouble. And yet, despite all that, you couldn't help but love him. Margolin didn't just play the role for laughs. He found the nervous energy underneath. The way Angel was always trying to bluff his way through life, terrified someone would finally call his bluff. His chemistry with Garner was electric. It wasn't just a side character tagging along. He was the chaos to Rockford's reluctant stability. Their back and forths felt unscripted, unpredictable, human. And the industry noticed. Margolin won 2 Primetime Emmys for the role, a rare achievement for a supporting character in a detective series. Then there was Rocky. Noah Beery Jr.'s portrayal of Rockford's father, Joseph "Rocky" Rockford, grounded the show in something rare for the genre: emotional intimacy. Rocky wasn't a plot device. He wasn't there for exposition or comic relief. He was a real dad. Frustrated, loyal, proud, sometimes confused, and often concerned for his son. Their relationship gave the show its emotional core. Where most detective shows ended with a solved case, the Rockford Files often ended with a quiet moment between father and son. An awkward hug, a shared beer, a conversation about nothing that somehow meant everything. Beery's performance was subtle but unforgettable. He gave us a man who had worked hard his whole life, trying to understand a son who chose a life of car chases and low-level crime instead of something safe. When Rocky disappeared from the screen after the original run ended and later passed away before the revival movies, fans felt it. And the first reunion film in 1994 included a dedication to Noah Beery Jr. that simply read, "We love you and miss you, Pidge." That nickname, Pidge, was what Beery's friends had called him since childhood. And in that single sentence, you could feel how much of the show's soul was gone. Behind the scenes, the show had a brain trust that most modern dramas would kill for. David Chase, who would go on to create The Sopranos, wrote episodes of The Rockford Files early in his career. Stephen J. Cannell, the co-creator, had a hand in shaping not just the tone of the show, but the rhythms of American television for decades. Together, they engineered a balance of crime, humor, and human messiness that gave the show its staying power. They didn't write stories about crimes. They wrote stories about people who happened to be around them. The structure of the show reflected that human focus. Take the answering machine gags. Each episode opened with a new message on Rockford's machine. And over the show's 6 seasons, there were 122 of them. These weren't throwaway bits. They were mini character sketches, callbacks to past episodes, inside jokes for loyal viewers. Some were absurd. Others were melancholy. They told you everything about Rockford's world before the opening credits even rolled. And they became iconic. Writers, staffers, even crew members pitched in to write new ones when inspiration ran dry. It was collaborative storytelling in its most unusual, delightful form. Then there was the Firebird. A copper-mist Pontiac Firebird, to be exact. It wasn't a glamorous sports car. It was beat up, practical, and always ready for a quick getaway. The car became an extension of Rockford himself, worn, reliable, and slightly out of place in the world of polished television detectives. And it wasn't just for show. The J-turns and evasive driving scenes weren't CGI or camera tricks. Garner did most of those stunts himself, giving each chase sequence a sense of real danger. When that Firebird slid across the pavement and peeled away, you felt it in your gut. And then there was the trailer. Parked beside the ocean in Malibu, Jim Rockford's tiny home office served as his sanctuary and his base of operations. It wasn't a stylish bachelor pad. It was cluttered, lived in. There were bills piled up, clothes on chairs, a rotary phone that always rang at the wrong time. And yet, that trailer came to feel like home. Not just to Rockford, but to the audience. It was the one place where he could escape the pressure of the cases the beatdowns, and the emotional fallout of being the guy who always got called when things went bad. These details, Angel, Rocky, the Firebird, the trailer, the answering machine, weren't background. They were the show. They created a universe with its own logic, its own moral compass, its own version of justice. It was a place you wanted to visit again and again. And when the show ended halfway through its 6th season, fans didn't just lose their favorite program. They lost that entire world. Section 5. The comeback that wasn't. When the Rockford Files went off the air in early 1980, fans didn't just miss the show. They missed a piece of their lives. For years, there was speculation. Would Jim Rockford ever return? Could James Garner be convinced to put the Firebird in gear one more time? And then, 15 years later, he did. From 1994 to 1999, CBS aired a series of 8 reunion films that brought back the world of Rockford in full color. But while the movies promised closure, what they really delivered was something else, a reminder of what had been lost. Why did these revivals feel so different? And what couldn't they recapture, no matter how hard they tried? The first movie aired in 1994 and was simply titled The Rockford Files, I Still Love L.A. It opened with a dedication to Noah Beery Jr., the beloved actor who had played Rocky Rockford and had passed away that same year. The dedication was short, but emotional. We love you and miss you, Pidge. That simple message underscored what fans already feared. This wasn't going to be the Rockford they remembered. Without Rocky, the show's emotional foundation was missing. The father-son dynamic had anchored the original series in something deeper than crime-solving. Without it, something vital had shifted. Still, James Garner returned, and for many fans, that was enough to tune in. He slipped back into the role of Jim Rockford with ease. The same deadpan delivery. The same beat-up charm that made him so watchable in the first place. But even as he delivered the lines and drove the Firebird again, you could see the difference. This Rockford was older, slower, more cautious. He wasn't dodging fists the way he used to. He wasn't chasing suspects through alleys. The wear and tear from the original series and from real life was impossible to hide. And instead of pretending otherwise, the TV movies leaned into it. The tone of the reunion films was noticeably different from the original series, where the show had once been fast-paced and punchy, with episodes built around tight, twisty plots and unpredictable characters. The movies were more reflective, slower. There was a kind of melancholy baked into them, like everyone on screen knew they were revisiting a world that could never be the same. Rockford was still getting involved in other people's problems, still taking cases he didn't want. But there was more resignation now. The stakes weren't always life or death. Sometimes they were personal. Sometimes they were just annoying. And that shift was deliberate. James Garner was no longer the high-energy leading man he had been in the 1970s. After years of injuries, surgeries, and his well-documented health issues, he wasn't capable of the physicality that had once defined the character. That limitation reshaped the way the stories were written. There were fewer car chases, fewer brawls, more dialogue-heavy scenes, more investigation from a distance. The movies became character studies more than thrillers. And for longtime fans, that had both upsides and downsides. On one hand, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing familiar faces return. Some supporting characters came back. Stuart Margolin reprised his role as Angel Martin in several of the films, still slippery, still getting Rockford into trouble. His presence was a bridge between eras. And his dynamic with Garner hadn't lost its spark. There were callbacks to earlier episodes, references to past cases, even jokes that only loyal viewers would catch. It was, in many ways, a reunion, not just for the cast, but for the audience. But on the other hand, the energy that once propelled the show forward was gone. The reunion movies were competent, even charming, but they weren't electric. The urgency had faded. The charm of the original series was in its pacing. The way it bounced from humor to danger to heartfelt moments without losing momentum. In the movies, that rhythm was replaced by long pauses, slower dialogue, and a sense that everyone was doing the best they could under different circumstances. That's not to say the movies were failures, far from it. They attracted solid ratings, especially from older audiences. They allowed new generations to meet Jim Rockford. They offered a kind of closure, especially for viewers who had never gotten a proper ending when the series was abruptly canceled in 1980. But they also highlighted just how much had changed. Not just in Rockford's world, but in television itself. By the mid-90s, TV crime dramas had evolved. Audiences were tuning into grittier, darker, more serialized shows like NYPD Blue and Homicide, Life on the Street. The Rockford movies felt like they belonged to a different time. Their tone was warmer, more nostalgic. They didn't try to keep up with the trend of moral ambiguity or extreme violence. And that, too, was part of their charm, but it also made them feel a little out of place. For some fans, the movies were a welcome epilogue. They got to spend more time with a character they loved, even if he was older and a little more tired. For others, the movies served as a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost. Not just the show's original energy, but its ensemble, its pace, and its emotional weight. Without Rocky, without the stakes of youth, without the grit of the 70s setting, the reunion films could never fully recreate the world they were honoring. There were 8 movies in total, each telling a standalone story. But unlike the show, there was no longer a sense that Rockford was living in real time, dealing with constant obstacles and evolving relationships. Instead, he felt like a relic, called out of retirement for one last job, again and again. And while Garner's performance was always reliable, always sharp, there was no denying that something had shifted. So when people talk about the Rockford Files and say it painfully ended, they're not just talking about the canceled 6th season or the lawsuit or the injuries. They're also talking about these reunion films, about how they tried to bring back a world that was already gone. They came close, closer than most revivals ever do, but they couldn't bring it all the way back. Because the thing that made the Rockford Files great wasn't just the characters or the stories, it was the moment in time it captured. And that moment, by the time the movies aired, was already in the past. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.